Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Dolika Jyoti Sharma from the Department of English, Guwahati University. The paper today is paper 13 and the module is 24. It's on the role of the International Committee of Red Cross. The International Committee of Red Cross, or ICRC in short, is one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world. It has a unique position within the international humanitarian law. It is an independent and a neutral organization whose mandate follows from the Geneva Convention of 1949. The ICRC was entrusted with some special rules by the international laws. The international humanitarian law explicitly refers to the role of the ICRC as the holder of these laws. The ICRC efficiently works in regions of armed conflict where no other international agencies can enter. So the International Committee of the Red Cross serves as a pan-global or as a neutral agency which has equal access to every part of the world, regardless of the political orientations of that part. The key operating areas of the International Committee of Red Cross are Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. The International Committee of Red Cross has largely been effective in addressing sexual violence, building respect for the law, cooperating with national societies, economic security, enabling people with disabilities, forensic sciences, and humanitarian action. In addition, healthcare in danger, helping detainees, humanitarian diplomacy, migrants, mine action, that is the impact of mines on people, protecting civilians, restoring family links, water and habitat, and working with the corporate sector are also primary areas for the International Committee of Red Cross.
When I tell people I work for the ICRC, they often look at me a bit blankly. You know, I say, Red Cross, Red Crescent. Oh, they say, are you a doctor? No, I tell them, I'm not a doctor. We do have doctors and nurses, although that's just one part of what we do. So what do you do? They ask. Well, have you heard of the Geneva Conventions? Of course, said one guy. But what does it mean in real terms? And I thought for a minute and then I said, it means that whenever there's an armed conflict, we can be there to help. It means that the people who've had to flee their homes because of fighting can have access to clean, drinkable water and food. It means that children who were separated from their families in conflict areas can be reunited with them again. It means that, when visiting detainees, we try to ensure they are kept according to international standards, with dignity and without fear of ill treatment. And how do you do all that? He asked. Well, my more than 13,000 colleagues operate in more than 80 countries around the world. But we don't do it alone. We work together with the national societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Our activities can take us deep into urban centers, or out to remote rural areas. Our impartiality, independence, and neutrality allow us to touch upon highly sensitive topics. Much of this work we actually do in peacetime. But then, armed conflict creates so many new kinds of needs, many of them not immediately visible, such as for psychosocial support, protection against sexual violence, or education on the dangers of anti-personnel mines. We work together with the people we assist, helping them improve their own livelihoods. So whatever their past, they have a future to look forward to. That is humanity in action.
The International Committee of Red Cross, or ICRC in short, is a part of the broader humanitarian movement called the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. Now, let's come to this particular organization, the larger organization, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Now, this is a worldwide humanitarian network which provides protection and assistance to people affected by disasters and conflicts. The movement is made up of almost 97 million volunteers, supporters, and staff in 186 countries. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has these three branches: the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and thirdly, the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. The ICRC works in cooperation with governments, donors, and other aid organizations to assist vulnerable people around the world. The issue of women's vulnerability has, in the recent times, received increased attention within international humanitarian laws as well as the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. The issue of women's protection has been taken into consideration in the movement as a whole, and more specific concern on women's safety in the war-torn areas has been laid down within the International Committee on Red Cross. So what we will see right now in this module is not the general nature of the International Committee of the Red Cross, but a look at a specific area that it covers, that is women and their experiences. The origin of the ICRC goes back to an increase in the consciousness regarding the suffering of wounded persons after the battlefield of Solferino in 1859. So we can see that the Red Cross goes back, as far as its origins are concerned, goes back to the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. Now, it was during this battlefield of Solferino in 1859 that when wounded soldiers were left without any treatment. All right. Now, this happens this used to happen, as it were, very frequently in the 19th century, but it's this particular battle that drew attention of the plight of wounded soldiers. Henry Durand and his colleague resolved to start a private humanitarian society, namely the International Relief Agency, to care for the sick and wounded combatants, which later became known as the International Committee of Red Cross. Thus arose the first Geneva Convention for War Victims in 1864. Article 6 of the Geneva Convention reads that wounded or sick combatants, to whatever nation they may belong, shall be collected and cared for. This one sentence aptly sums up the Law of Geneva, also known as Red Cross Law. Its mandate is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of armed conflict and internal disturbances, and to provide them with assistance and to act as promoter and guardian for international humanitarian law. Thus, we see that the Red Cross concerns itself with victims of conflict, regardless of the side, the political or the military side to which they belong. Now, the principles of the ICRC were streamlined, were given a better shape in the 20th International Conference of Red Cross, which announced 7 fundamental principles of the ICRC on the basis of which it operates. The areas are first on humanity, where the Red Cross says that its aim is to protect the life and health of human dignity. It goes back to the birth of the Red Cross with the aim of assisting the wounded on the battlefield without discrimination and to lessen and prevent human suffering in such situations. The fundamental principle is that of impartiality. In providing assistance to the vulnerable people, the ICRC avoids any kind of discrimination based on nationality, religion, class, and political beliefs. It provides its service on the basis of the needs of individuals and gives priority to the urgent ones. The third principle is its neutrality. The ICRC maintains neutrality in continuing its works and never engages in any kind of controversy, whether of political, racial, religious or ideological beliefs. It maintains a non-judgmental view of events. The fourth fundamental principle is that of independence. The Red Cross works independently so that it can work at any time when necessary or provide assistance or services according to the principles of the Red Cross. Voluntary service is yet another fundamental principle that the Red Cross works with. The ICRC provides its services voluntarily. It does not seek any kind of monetary or other gains from its activities. Another important principle is unity. The Red Cross performs its duties with unity within any country and provides a space where everyone works unitedly. And finally, the final guiding principle for the Red Cross is its universality. The works of the ICRC are universal in nature. It, along with other societies, helps people who are in distressed situations all over the world. So we can see how these fundamental principles, they in fact interact with each other in order to provide a neutral, non-judgmental, but very accessible agency, accessible care and concern for victims of combat. The basis of the ICRC's actions, as I've already mentioned, is the international humanitarian law, or the set of laws which are at the core of the Red Cross. As the promoter and guardian of the IHL, that is the international humanitarian laws, the ICRC ensures faithful implementation of these. The main source of international humanitarian law are the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their 2 additional protocols of 1977. The 4 Geneva Conventions are: firstly, the Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armed Forces in the Field. Secondly, the Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded, Sick and Shipwrecked Members of Armed Forces at Sea at the Second Geneva Convention. The third is a convention related to the treatment of prisoners of war during the Third Geneva Convention. And finally, the convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in times of war, which was taken during the Fourth Geneva Convention. 2 additional protocols were introduced which supplement these 4 conventions. The first being the protection of victims of international armed conflict, and secondly, the protection of victims of non-international armed conflict. These conventions seek to cover both international as well as national armed conflict, so that it does not miss out on any group or any kind of victim. The IHL affords women with the same protection as men, be it as combatants or as civilians. In addition, recognizing the specific needs of women, the IHL also grants some additional protection and rights to them. If we look at the specific protection of women under the international humanitarian laws, Lindsay in 2001 states that the IHL offer specific protection for women as Article 14 of the Third Geneva Convention. It says that women should be treated with all respect due to their sex. The other provisions of the Third Geneva Convention which spell out how these general obligations should be implemented are: provision of separate detention quarters and sanitary facilities for female prisoners of war, and secondly, if women are confined, they must be under the immediate supervision of women. Women as members of the civilian population become the first victims in any situation of conflict. This takes the form primarily of sexual violence against women, even though no doubt the international humanitarian law provides extensive protection towards them. For example, paragraph 2 of Article 27 of the 4th Geneva Convention and Article 75 and 76 of Protocol 1 state that women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape, forced prostitution, or any form of indecent assault. There are several provisions of international humanitarian law which accords special protection to women. For example, the Articles 3, 4 of Convention of 1929, then in the Geneva Convention of 1949, Articles 3 and 12 of Convention 1, similarly Articles 3 and 12 of Convention 2, Articles 3, 14, 16, 25, 29, 49, 88, 3, 97, 108 of Convention 3. In Convention 4, Articles 3, 14, 16, 17, and so on. Then the additional protocols of 1977, Protocol 1 and Protocol 2 that I have mentioned earlier. The role of the ICRC is thereby very crucial to civilians in particular. The ICRC performs a wide range of activities through which the organization has endeavored to respond to diverse humanitarian problems by developing and diversifying the concept and idea of international humanitarian law, and by attempting to remind the people it deals with of their obligations and duty to respect universally acknowledged humanitarian principles. Lindsay further states that international humanitarian laws are at the core of the ICRC's protection activities. Its role as promoter and guardian of international humanitarian law has three primary facets. First is the promotion and dissemination of the laws. Secondly, the monitoring compliance with humanitarian laws. And thirdly, contribution to the development of these laws. In its role as promoter and guardian, the ICRC works for the faithful application of humanitarian law. Thus, the work of the ICRC is directed in two ways. Firstly, it is operational in its work in helping victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence. And secondly, it works for developing and promoting international humanitarian laws and principles. So one is a more pragmatic function, that of actually helping victims. The third is a more policy-based or philosophical function, which looks at developing and promoting humanitarian laws and principles. There is a close link between these two ICRC functions or activities. The second gives the scope of successful operation for the first, and alternatively, the identification of needs in the second stage is based on the experiences acquired from the first. It is this nature of work that marks out the very identity of the ICRC. It also helps to make the ICRC unique among other humanitarian organizations internationally. However, there are some limitations in the directives of principles and activities of the ICRC. For most of the time, the RCIC works in situations of armed conflict, whether it is an international or non-international context. Besides working during the time that armed conflicts are taking place, the ICRC also works for activities like the repatriation of prisoners of war or persons detained in relation to the hostilities, family reunification, and the search for missing persons, and so on. Generally, the ICRC works within the territories of states which are themselves involved in the armed conflict and affected by its effects. But sometimes it also works with neighboring countries, especially with those states which are indirectly affected by influxes of refugees as a result of armed conflicts. Thus, the ICRC has to maintain some limitations in terms of context, time, and geography in carrying out its work. During armed conflict, the ICRC endeavors to protect and assist victims of armed conflict, visit prisoners of war and civilian internees, transmit Red Cross messages to and from family members, establish hospitals and safety zones for the civilian population, participate in relief programs for displaced persons, actively disseminate the rule and principles of the IHL. Although all problems that women face in armed conflict are yet to be resolved, a start has been made through the initiative of the Red Cross. For example, in 1998, the ICRC initiated a study to examine how women are affected by armed conflict around the world. The study is to form the basis of guidelines for activities of the organization in relation to protection and assistance of women and children in armed conflict. The International Red Cross Society looks at, as we can now see, looks at women in conflict zones. It acknowledges with all seriousness the presence and the insidiousness of sexual violence against women in armed conflict. Over the years, the ICRC has made some attempts to mitigate the horrors of conflict for women. For example, efforts were made during the Second World War to ensure the lawful treatment of women prisoners of war. In the period after the Second World War, from time to time the ICRC made efforts to ensure the human treatment of women in various conflict situations. The increasing recognition by the ICRC that women in armed conflict pose distinctive challenges to the IHL has continued. The 26th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which took place in 1996, adopted a consensus resolution dealing separately with sexual violence against women. Here is that by taking a separate an individual consensus, it actually focuses, it takes the focus more deeply, more specifically on the sexual violence against women as one of the strategies of war. All right, and its impact on women's rights and health. The specific situation of women affected by armed conflict was one of the issues addressed by the 27th International Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference in Geneva in October 1999. The ICRC took this opportunity to pledge that it would take appropriate action to assess and address the specific protection, health and assistance needs of women and girls affected by armed conflict to alleviate the plight of the most vulnerable. In order to provide tangible protection that is seen, that is felt, to women during armed conflict, the ICRC has to direct its activities in some definite ways, such as in making people involved in armed conflicts aware of the international humanitarian laws and make sure that these laws are respected by everybody. In its awareness campaigns, focused on the two-tiered protection that is offered by the humanitarian laws for women, that is protection as human beings as well as protection as women. In continuing its present protection works, it has acquired, built on the experiences it has acquired from the field. In 2000, the ICRC conducted a study, namely Women Facing War, to assess the effects of armed conflict on women, needs of women in war, protection provided for women by international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee laws, and ICRC activities on behalf of women throughout its worldwide operations. The study mainly focused on issues like physical safety, sexual violence, displacement, access to healthcare and hygiene, food, water, and shelter, and the problem of missing relatives and its impact on survivors' access to personal documentation. Access to sources of livelihood and the situations of detention and internment were also areas of interest, were very important areas of interest. After conducting the study of women and violence, the ICRC tried to implement the right actions based on the general findings and conclusion of the study. The ICRC specifically deals with the condition of detention of women in respect to international standards of human rights and international humanitarian law. It tries to ensure that women are efficiently protected from inhuman or degrading treatment, appropriate detention conditions exist for women, and that any specific conditions for mothers with children are met. Women are detained in separate quarters from male detainees. Women are guarded by female staff. The presence of female prison staff appropriately trained to deal with female detainees. That women have the possibility to maintain contact with their families and, where possible, to receive family visits. And finally, that judicial guarantees are fully respected. The intention behind the development of the ICRC's institutional strategy from 2015 to 2018 is to put in the picture the global changes and guide the work of the organization for the next 4 years. It came into operation on the basis of the consultations with ICRC's major stakeholders that includes National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies and major donors, ICRC's professional circles engaged in humanitarian action, and its staff in the headquarters. The Assembly, the supreme governing body of the ICRC, adopts the strategy as a model to better equip themselves with the political changes in the world. It prepares a framework to support the ICRC decision makers in setting operational and thematic priorities in addressing the emerging global, political, violent armed conflict and policy challenges. It locates the ICRC's actions within the larger international humanitarian response to armed conflicts and other conditions of violence, particularly in relation to the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. The ICRC has observed and acknowledged the shift in the global international relations, which on one hand sees a diverse set of security and political agendas shaping current debates, especially among emerging powers, and on the other hand sees national governments affected by armed conflict and other situations of violence, which take an active role in designing humanitarian response strategies and coordinating relief efforts. It often questions these situations, that is, these circumstances often question the significance of the independent humanitarian action. Consequently, the ICRC is confronted in today's world with increasingly divergent and dispersed views about the ways humanitarian operations should be conducted and how to mobilize governments to respect and to ensure respect for IHL. Whereas some governments have explicitly raised questions about the fundamental principles of international humanitarian action in times of crisis, others have been openly politicizing humanitarian operations and access to require more robust and direct interventions in the domestic affairs of particular states. In order to realize its vision in such a multifaceted and dynamic environment with such wide-ranging humanitarian needs and challenges, the ICRC is required to take bold steps and make progressive choices in the face of such a challenging environment. It must construct its choices and steps on their existing strengths and find alternative ways to overcome the challenges to realize the mission. In conclusion, we can see thereby that the International Red Cross Society is one of the most important components of international humanitarian law to protect and assist the people affected by armed conflict. The ICRC thereby stresses the susceptibility of women in war-torn areas in particular, and it works to protect and assist these women during and after armed conflict. With this, we come to the end of the module. Thank you.